Hi class, let's talk about how we are going to solve Lab 33, which is building a pyramid using nested for loops. All right, this pyramid is going to be made up of asterisks, and we're going to allow the user to determine the number of rows. Now, you, the programmer, need to validate the user input, meaning that you need to make sure that the user gives you a number between 1 and 25. So anything less than 1 or greater than 25 is invalid, and the way I want you to handle that is to use a do-while loop to validate the input. So if the input that you've read in is invalid, just read in another number and overwrite the number that you just read in for your, let's say, numRows variable. And you'll continue to repeat that loop until you have a number that falls in the range of 1 to 25. So as long as the numRows that you've read in is less than 1 or numRows is greater than 25, then go ahead and read in another number. All right, once you've validated the input, in other words, you know that you have a valid number of rows, then it is time for you to build your pyramid. And we're going to use a example pyramid of size 5 to explain how this is going to happen. So let's assume the user's entered 5. Therefore, our pyramid that we build needs to be made up of 5 rows. Now let's look at this table that I've given you. And this table can actually lead you through the logic of how you're going to solve this problem using the nested for loops. So at each row, you need to output a leading number of spaces followed by a single asterisk, followed by some trailing asterisks, and then this shows your actual output. So in row 1, we have 4 leading spaces, and then we have an asterisk, and then we have 0 trailing spaces. So in other words, that's a new line character. Now in row 2, if you look over here at the actual output, this is what your program is going to be outputting. There are actually in this output for row 2, 3 leading spaces, followed by 1 asterisk, and then followed by 2 trailing asterisks. Now let's look at row 3. We have 2 leading spaces, 1 single asterisk, followed by 4 trailing asterisks. So here we are, 2 leading spaces, followed by a single asterisk. Then we have the 4 trailing asterisks. All right, in row 4, we have 1 leading space, followed by an asterisk, followed by 6 trailing asterisks. Then we have our new line character. And then in line 5, well, we have 0 leading asterisk. We still output our single asterisk. And then we output our trailing asterisks. Now, the reason we have this method of leading and trailing asterisks is because this is how we're going to implement nested for loops to output this pyramid. Okay, so in the hints section here, I give you some information that can help you write your nested for loops. Hint number 1, each iteration of your outside for loop should output the leading spaces followed by a single asterisk. And then I tell you to use set W. And step 2 is actually still part of this same hint. It says if the number of rows, and I'm telling you here that the variable is numRows, so if numRows contains the number of rows in the pyramid, and row counter is used as the row counter, so we're talking about here, the row counter, and that's the counter inside, that's the row counter used on the outside for loop, then each row has numRows minus row counter leading spaces before the asterisk. So in other words, here I'm on row 1, right? And there are 5 rows, so numRows 5 minus row counter 1, 5 minus 1 is 4. There's my number of leading spaces. All right, let's see if that holds true for the second row. numRows is still 5. My row counter is 2. 5 minus 2 is 3. That is correct for the leading number of spaces. Okay, so let's check out row 3, see if it works for row 3. numRows is still 5. 5 minus 3 is 2. There's my leading spaces. That is correct. And one more test. Let's check out row 4. Num rows is still 5. Row counter is 4. 5 minus 4 is 1, so we have one leading space. All right, so you can use this logic in your set W. So if you use set W with the argument num rows minus row counter plus 1, and then output a single asterisk, you're going to have the correct number of leading spaces. Now, the reason we're offsetting this is by 1 is so that you make room for that single asterisk that you need to output. Okay, so that'll get us the leading spaces and a single asterisk. This is the outside for loop. Now we're going to need to make use of a nested for loop. So outside for loop is used to repeat num rows times. And each time we're going to output using set W a single asterisk with the leading spaces, which is what I just explained. Okay, so the inside for loop needs to start after you've output that leading number of spaces and the single asterisk. So now we're getting to the hints for the inside for loop. It should be used to output the remaining asterisks in the row. So for example, in row 1, it needs to output 0 asterisks. In row 2, it needs to output 2 trailing asterisks, because remember, we've output the first asterisk in each of these rows. So the inside nested for loop will be outputting the trailing asterisks in each row. Now, I tell you that each row consists of row counter times 2 minus 2 trailing asterisks. So let's check this out and make sure that's this column right here. We're talking about row counter times 2 minus 2. So row counter, we are on row counter 1 here. 1 times 2 is 2 minus 2 is 0. That is correct for here, for row 1. All right, let's check out the math for row 2. Once again, row counter is 2 times 2 minus 2. So 2 times 2 is 4. 4 minus 2 is 2. That is correct. All right, let's check out row 3. Row counter 3 times 2 is 6. Minus 2 is 4. Do you see that? I'm using this to determine how many extra trailing out, or how many trailing out asterisks my program needs to output. So what I want you to do is write a nested for loop that actually just outputs a single asterisk, but your nested for loop will repeat row counter times 2 minus 2 times. Now remember that your row counter is used in your outside for loop, and so your inside for loop is going to need a different counter. So what I've given you is a sample nested inside for loop that uses J as the counter. So here I have a J variable that I start at 1. And then as long as my J counter is less than or equal to my row counter times 2 minus 2, I output a single asterisk. So that will actually generate all of the trailing asterisks. Now, when this loop terminates, I'm still inside that other for loop where I had row counter going as my row counter. So my row counter will be incremented, and then I will output the leading spaces followed by an asterisk, and then I get to this inside nested for loop that will repeat row counter times 2 minus 2 times, which will always output the proper number of trailing asterisks. So these are the hints I've given you to try to help you complete this programming project. When you complete this project, you will have, once you've done it correctly using the nested for loops and the technique that I've given you, a pyramid should be output that has the number of rows specified by the user. Now remember, let's look at figure 1 here. If the user gives us a number that's outside the valid range, we just need to throw it away and read in another value. So these 3 values are read in one at a time inside a do while. And the while conditional expression test whether or not the value we read in is outside the range. If it is, then we just repeat that while loop and read in another number. 101 is outside the range, so we repeat the do while loop and read in another number. Now, after we get to this 5, well, when we get it to the 5, our while loop test expression, do while loop test expression will be false, and that's when we fall out. And we actually have then in our numRows variable a good value that can be used to create a valid pyramid with 5 rows in this example. If we read in a 10, you should create a pyramid made up of 10 asterisks. So I hope these hints help and you are able to complete this programming project.